Welcome to the New Books Network.
You're listening to New Books in Geography, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. I'm your host for today, Stentor Danielson, from the Department of Geography, Geology, and the Environment at Slippery Rock University. Today, I'll be talking to Brenda Belletti, translator of The Nature of Space by Milton Santos, published this year by Duke University Press. Dr. Belletti, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, as I said in the introduction there, I'm talking to a translator here. So, I'd like to start off and find out a little bit about the original author of the work you're translating. So, who was Milton Santos, and why is he important to have translated?
Well, Milton Santos is probably the most well-known Brazilian geographer. He's a Brazilian geographer and philosopher who had a tremendous influence not only on Brazilian geography, but on critical geography in general, I think in many languages across the world over the last several decades. But he is little known in the English-speaking world because until very recently, his work had not been translated into English. Santos's work addresses regional development, globalization, the theorization of space. He was born in the early part of the 20th century in Bahia, in the northeast of Brazil, to a poor family in the interior. He was educated in Bahia, and he became an advisor for the Brazilian government on regional planning. And I think it was in that work that he began to see all of the limitations of the problems of modernist planning, and began to develop the critique that became so important and influential on development geography and critical geography in the decades to come. He was exiled from Brazil under the military dictatorship, and during that time he lived and worked in the US, I think in Germany and France. And so his work was was actively in dialogue in real time with the geographic and work that was going on in all of those places. And he was, conceptually in dialogue with, a century of continental philosophy, in addition to all the work going on in Latin America. So his work, his experience, analyzing the regional development dynamics in Brazil, engaged in geography across the world, led to this body of work that has become very influential. And, in American geography, he worked in the early 70s. He had a couple of publications that were translated in Antipode. He worked with people like Neil Smith and Richard Peet. But beyond those few publications, I think it's only been in the last couple of years that geographers have been getting a sense of who he is, because there has been a move to start to translate his work so that his influence can be understood more explicitly, and also so that people can have direct access to that work. I think I would also add that, because his work has been so formative in Brazilian geography, most Anglophone researchers working in Brazil have also been very influenced by his work, because not only directly through studying him, but also because his students have been so influential in Brazilian development geography and Brazilian critical geography and the geography of Brazilian social movements, that a lot of the influence of his work has extended through that work into Anglophone geography as well.
Yeah, and this is very helpful to get this work translated so an English-speaking audience can engage with it more easily, because I've been doing the Portuguese course on Duolingo, but I'm not nearly at the level that I can read a complex academic text yet. So, this is very helpful. So that brings us then to you. So tell us about who you are, your background, and how you ended up being the person to take on this project of translating Milton Santos.
Okay, well, I have a PhD in geography myself from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I did my dissertation research on struggles over extractive resources in the Brazilian Amazon during the commodity boom in the mid-2000s, when global commodity prices were skyrocketing and a lot of the then progressive Latin American governments were growing their extractive resource development through partnerships with multinational corporations or by opening markets to those corporations, much of what is still going on today. So I guess all of that is to say that I was and am a student of the dynamics of evolving global capitalism and the ways that that's linked up to and plays out through Brazilian regional development and the visions for Brazilian regional development. And also a student of how people confront and attempt to overcome those rather totalizing dynamics. So through that work, I, was a student of Santos's work, and my own work was very much informed by not only his work, but the work of many of his students, some of the great Brazilian geographers of today, like Carlos Walter Porto Gonçalves, Ariovaldo de Oliveira, Fernando Manzano Fernandes, and others. And so I encountered his work when I was doing my research in Portuguese. And as interest grew here in translating the important works, or many important works in philosophy and theory from Latin America, and Duke Press had the project to take on the translation of this book, I was really excited about it and decided to do it.
All right. So let's now get into a little bit about the content of the book for people that aren't familiar with Milton Santos's work. So in the introduction, he says, quote, "My explicit goal in writing this book is to produce a system of ideas that can serve as a point of departure for a descriptive and interpretive system of geography." So that's a really ambitious goal right there, right? That's a huge thing to take on. So can you give us the kind of Cliff's Notes, highlights of what are the major features of this system of geography that he develops and explains in this book?
Yeah. I think that to start to try and understand what this system is that he's describing, it's worth looking at another part of the introduction where he talks about some of his frustrations with geography. Because I think that a lot of the frustrations that he's expressing with geography in his introduction still arguably stand, at least in part, in the American university today. And he says that one of the limitations of geography is that geographers, and these are generalizations, of course, there are obviously clear exceptions, but often fail to rigorously theorize their disciplinary object, space. And as a result, geography can tend to lack the analytic concepts and methods that he thinks ought to define the discipline. And so he says, instead, geographers tend to draw concepts from other disciplines that are not adequate to their analysis, that function more as metaphors than as analytic frameworks, and that the field can then be subject to the whims of what's theoretically in fashion, which at the time he's dealing with, he's experiencing a tremendous amount of dissatisfaction with postmodernism, and then he's saying that the field can tend towards description rather than explication. And so he's on the one hand, lacking a clear disciplinary object can make geography very exciting and open, right? In its long disciplinary tradition, it can arguably be the study of anything that happens on the face of the earth. And so geographers are often engaged in studying some of the most cutting edge subjects. But he explains then, why ultimately that analysis can be shallow, because lacking a clear method and object, scholarship can fall into, I think how he would characterize it would be like the promiscuous application of disparate frameworks to describe particular situations in a way that just then affirms the validity of that framework. It's like methods in geography that he's frustrated with tend to be treated as the ways that we acquire information regarding the empirical, right? Through GIS, surveys, ethnography, to which then we often only retroactively apply our theoretical frameworks, right? So he's saying geographic inquiry is reduced to a naive empiricism on the one hand and a disconnected and autistic theoreticism on the other that we try to reconnect. And so what he's trying to do then is saying what we actually need is a method for geography that would mean developing an interpretive framework adequate for apprehending the world, or, you know, what he's talking about as quote unquote the world is like the social totality that's in constant dialogue with that totality. So we need to have a framework that's itself in motion, transformed through a shifting practice of analysis and a shifting understanding of the object of analysis, you know, space. So in other words, like, I think I would say that Santos's method is like deeply dialectic, right? He's trying to, what he does in the book is he tries to enact a dialectical method for theorizing the concept of space by walking through a series of like approximations of all of its component analytic concepts, right? The book is set up so the method is a method of analysis. The method is to constantly be attempting to identify all of the concepts necessary to understand the world that we're studying. And in order to understand each of those concepts, we have to be constantly developing each of those concepts and then setting them into dialogue with the other concepts that follow. And it's by doing that, by looking at all these different analytic concepts, technique, intentionality, object, action, event, totality, territory, you know, he has many, many concepts in this book that he tries to clarify. Then he puts them in conversation with each other and then tries to put them into conversation with the world. So that's how I would kind of describe his method.
Yeah, and I think I actually, from your little description there, actually, just as you were saying that, kind of helped me understand what he's doing a little better, because you're right that it is this dialectical kind of approach that he walks you through in the book, and so it keeps circling around back to some of these same ideas, and it's not like a textbook where, like, you know, you start from the foundations and establish that and then work forward from there. And so that's a thing that we sometimes expect to see if somebody says, well, here's my big theoretical opus that's going to explain things. You know, we kind of expect it sometimes to work in that foundational kind of way, and you get a little lost if it's not doing that. But, you know, it's got this dialectical kind of movement to the way that he puts it together.
Exactly. It's like there's never like a what is space, what is territory, what is, you know, there's no answer to any of those questions. It's more he's demonstrating to you a practice for how you would approach those things that you have to kind of take on as a method.
Yeah, so I'm trying to take notes as I'm reading. It's like, but he hasn't said exactly what that means yet. It's like, well, that's what you get once you get through the whole thing. You'll understand what it means. So let's then, if we can dig into a few of these concepts that he does use. One of the big ones is this sort of pairing of object and action, and these two ideas like bounce back and forth off of each other a lot through the book. So could you explain a little bit about how he's using these terms and, you know, how the relationship between them works?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think if I need to talk about technique first. But okay, no, let's start. Okay. So I'll start that answer over. So yes, right at the beginning of the book, he gives us a working definition, we could say, or a working conceptual definition of space, which he says is an indissoluble set of systems of objects and systems of actions, right? Or an indivisible, interdependent, contradictory group of systems of objects and systems of actions that form a framework, you know, in which our world unfolds. And I think objects, we could say, neither of these things for him, objects or actions, can, like by the definition that he's given us, exist on their own. They have a no philosophical reality extracted from that relationality, is what he's trying to say, right? And so he says, but objects, then we could think of as like the the things that exist in the world that visibly make up like landscape. Right? Like, so he says there are things like and the world moves historically from natural objects, things that are, completely come from nature, like I don't know, a tree, through a transformation of objects through their interaction with the social world over time to become more technical. So objects then are transformed through their relation to human beings, and they actually become new things, right? So we move from, natural objects to technical ones. So you can imagine like natural objects are ones that would be completely produced by nature, and technical ones would be ones that are completely produced by information, like the computer, right? Today, he's constantly trying to set up a historical progression of these things for us also. So today we live in the world of like cybernetic objects. But objects themselves, he understands as the crystallization of social forms. So within objects are contained all of these societal dynamics, right? So we could think about things like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example of social forms, like law, custom. They give rise to particular kinds of objects like property, right? And so in that way, you can understand how the social conditions the creation of our material reality. And then he says that material reality itself conditions our social world, right? So, the organization of property means that we interact in particular ways in our society. And then how are objects created? Objects are created through actions. And actions for him aren't only like behavior directed towards a goal, right? Like actions are things that human societies do to the world, behaviors that they do to the world, but it's not only conscious behavior, right? That behavior itself is also always conditioned by a constellation of forces that is material and social, right? A social structure and a social structure embodied in objects. And so space for him is the relationship between all of those things, right? So you can see, hopefully you can see, I hope that isn't too convoluted a description, the way that objects are constantly the sort of expression of the sedimented history of human societal relations, of the social totality. And that historical social totality is constantly conditioning the ways that we act. And that gives rise to this thing called space, which is nothing but these sets of relations.
The world is racing to get back to normal and start meeting up in person again. But after the year we've all had, getting back to feeling normal takes time. If you're feeling overwhelmed by it all, you're not alone. Something like 50% of Americans struggle with their mental health. We all need help sometimes. I know I do. So what should you do? Well, you should ask for help. Talkspace makes it easy to get that help. Talkspace matches you with a licensed therapist and makes it easy to schedule live video sessions, all from the comfort of your device. You can start messaging your therapist the same day you sign up, and you work with your therapist on your own schedule without having to wait weeks for appointments. Whether you're a parent, a student, a millennial, or just someone having a hard day, Talkspace can help you feel better. Talkspace offers individual and couples therapy in addition to medication prescription services. Whether you're experiencing depression, anxiety, or other problems, Talkspace is the #1 online therapy platform to help you sort through any issue. Start feeling better with a single message. Match with a licensed therapist when you go to Talkspace.com and get $100 off your first month with the promo code NBN. That's $100 off when you use the code NBN at Talkspace.com.
Okay. And so he's got this, what might seem like this kind of abstract theory going on that you've kind of laid out some of the terms of, but this is also in a way a very historically situated book, because he's really interested in explaining how we got to the specific kind of world that we're living in at the time he's writing, kind of the end of the 20th century, the way that the world works, and that historical trajectory is a big part of of what he's trying to do in the book. And so, a lot of stuff has happened over the last couple decades since he wrote the book and since he passed away. So I was wondering if you would be willing to venture some thoughts about how the things that he was writing about apply to our world now, a couple decades into the 21st century.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important question. I think that the importance, and this is kind of what I'm trying to think through today, I think that one of the really important contributions of the nature of space that actually differentiates it from some of the other work that we might be familiar with in this, geographic project to theorize space is what I actually want to go back for a second to the first chapter and his introduction of this concept of technique. Because I think that it is his use of technique that actually gives us an important tool for thinking about the world that we live in today. So in that first chapter, before he even dives into defining this, this concept of space, he starts by saying technique, which is like technica is the word that he uses, and it could be translated in different ways, right? It could be translated as technique. Some authors use, like Mumford uses the word technics. Murray Bookchin uses the Greek techne, but many philosophers have tried to grapple with this idea of technique, which is a way to move away. Like often today you hear us talking about technology, right? Especially today, and when we're talking about the 20th century, we're talking about technology, technological domination, and this idea of technique mandates that we not sort of separate out technology and fetishize technology as something that has the ability to move on its own, right? Technique situates technology in the web of social relations, in the web of principles through which the technological is created, right? It's the social. It says that like technology emerges from a social formation. It's not, the innovation of tools, right? Which is essentially what technology is, right? When we think of technology, we think like stone tool to the computer. Doesn't happen independent of the social milieu. And so to fetishize technology as something that maybe, happens on its own or is the result of competition or innovation is an idea that only emerges under capitalism, right? And so the work that Santos is doing here is to sort of re-embed technology in the world of the technical, and to understand that, and to make this argument that it is through what he calls the shifting technical milieu that we need to understand, in a sense, the prehistory to this moment. And so he's constantly saying, so if we look at history, we see he's constantly trying to sort of periodize history to say what are the major shifts that happen throughout human history in order to get to what he's dealing with, this question of globalization at the end of the 20th century, and, the beginning of the 21st century, ultimately. So he looks back into history and says, okay, all of these moments of innovation, right, from the tool to the machine to the cybernetics, these look like moments of technological transformation, but they're actually moments of social transformation. And that's what the geographical milieu gives us, right? A shifting understanding of the instrumental and social means that people utilize to realize their lives, to produce space. So he's constantly doing this historical analytic in terms of a shifting geographic milieu. Now, he gets to the end of the 20th century and he says, we've moved from, a natural system through a technical system, through a techno-scientific system, which he calls the technical scientific informational milieu, which he says is substantively different from all previous technical systems in that it's both, he says, today we live in a world where the system that we live in, our relations, our technologies, our social understandings are decontextualized, right? Meaning that it doesn't need to emerge from a local context in order to be embedded there, right? So I think that's an important concept. It's like, why does every coffee shop in every city look the same? He says, because even though everyone might have a local coffee shop in their neighborhood, the rationality that's leading to the creation of this coffee shop, right? Financialization, branding, real estate development, all of these dynamics are not emerging from that local context. And so our localities start to take on a sameness across the entire world, right? And that's something that he says is particular to the techno-scientific system. And then this system is also globalized in that it's now emerging everywhere. That same coffee shop is everywhere across the world. And so he says this contemporary technique is defined by informational technologies, right? Our world is increasingly disembedded from our local realities and determined by the global moves of like data and finance. And so I think that this is really important. And I think like part of the reason I'm giving you all this background is because I think this is exactly the question that we need to be referencing. We need to be figuring out in order to determine, like, are we in a substantively different moment now than when Santos was writing at the end of the 20th century? Because what he's offering us here is he's saying, like, in prior historical moments, people created what he called intentional objects, right? They created the things that were necessary for life. And then by the end of the 20th century, the objects that we have, the things that we use, the things that we're creating aren't necessarily directed towards our immediate needs. Right? The objects that we have are set free from the need to respond to anything in the real world or the dynamics of particular locations or contexts, right? My computer isn't created to do anything like immediately relevant to my localized life, right? My computer, it allows me to move throughout the world. It's not responding to like a particular context. And he says the proliferation of these techniques has produced a tendency towards a coordinated control of society, right? Towards the subjugation of people by smart machines, towards the elimination of the capacity for critical thought, right? Which is like pretty prescient, I think, 20 years ago for what we're living through today. So even though I think often Santos seems at pains to separate himself from a kind of Marxism, right? Because I think at the time he's trying to separate himself from maybe like a vulgar and deterministic or dogmatic Marxism at the time. He doesn't use the language of Marx. He is like painting a really powerful picture of, what we might call the universalization of the commodity fetish, right? Where we've lost our own capacity for subjectivity in the face of the subsumption of the entire world to the, what Marx calls the automatic subject of capital. So in that sense, it's hard to answer so that's a very long sort of background to try and answer the question that you pose, which is, how would we extend Santos's analysis into the world of today? And I think what I just did was try to do that, right? I think that he's pulling out dynamics that are already present and that are sort of shockingly already present at the end of the 20th century to explain a world that we live today at a much greater level of intensity, right? Like all of this, our world, I think, is even just much more disembedded than it was 20 years ago. I mean, if we look at the examples of just what we've lived through in the last year and a half or 2 years, the capacity to continue to move a society almost, largely based in information, when the society is, largely shut down for the lockdown that we've lived through, I think says a lot about the way that our capacity and our mechanisms for socialization have been disembedded from a localized context. And so in a sense, I think that we could certainly and ought to and need to develop. I think that the framework that he offers us is already previewing the world that we live in today. Although I think even he would probably be surprised by or I guess maybe he predicted, right, the increasingly totalizing nature of the technical, scientific, informational milieu that he starts to characterize at the end of the 20th century.
Okay, yeah, so I think lots of room for people to take his work and apply it and draw out some of those connections. I imagine probably a lot of people writing in Portuguese have already started work on that, but now English speakers can get in on it too with having access to the text. And you mentioned Marxism and how he incorporates some of those ideas, and that's one of the things that I really noticed reading this is that this is like one of the most citation dense things that I've read in a while, that he's just constantly like digesting the ideas of this huge range of different thinkers, including folks that I'm familiar with when I see the the name in the citation, and then people I haven't heard of, people that are writing in other languages that I don't speak and I haven't encountered, and he's taking all this stuff from so many different directions across a really broad swath of history as well, that he is citing stuff going back decades and then up to the present when he's writing, and he's digesting all of this and putting it together into his own perspective that engages with and incorporates all these things without being kind of a doctrinaire follower of one or another school, like a Marxist or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, and I can tell you as a translator, that was one of the biggest challenges of this work, because he's interpreting all these people into Portuguese. So just in a logistical sense, and there was a lot of, I think, just to repeat what you're saying, the breadth of his knowledge of philosophy, of theory of geography, like you're saying, spans continents and spans, more than a century. And so I think that's why this work was such a challenge to translate, because I had to chase down like all of those citations, read them in their, in English where I could find them, to make sure that I could understand the concepts that he was writing about. And so had to really go through the process of learning, not only deciphering what he was saying and try and interpret it and make it legible to an English language audience, but in order to do that, I had to read so much of the philosophy that he was referencing. And it really is like a rather awe-inspiring intellectual project that he was engaged in.
Yeah, I was just imagining that you could do like a graduate seminar where you read this book and then you just chase down his major references and find those people, and just doing that would be like this really stimulating graduate seminar project, both for understanding the ideas he's talking about, but then also just like practicing that form of scholarship.
Totally. I totally agree. Yeah. And seeing exactly how like this work that he's doing of moving concepts forward, right? Taking somebody's idea, taking it up, trying to grow it a little bit, putting these different authors in conversation with one another in a really explicit way in order to get to the next step, basically, is exactly the method that he's trying to work out. So that graduate seminar that you're proposing, I think, is like exactly the kind of work that he's trying to inspire, right? How do you actually, go inside of a conversation in order to unfold it one step forward?
Yeah, and my department is unfortunately undergrad only, so it's a free idea putting out there for listeners who teach at the graduate level. So in your last answer, you started to talk a bit about your approach as a translator. So I now want to move in to talking about that, and I want to pick up on something that you said back when you were explaining this concept of technique, where you mentioned, in the original Portuguese, he uses the term técnica, and then you referenced how some other authors have had similar concepts that they've used other words for, drawing on, ancient Greek versions of the word and stuff, but you chose to translate it with, a fairly common English word, and that seemed to be your approach throughout the book, that you weren't keeping a whole bunch of his terms in Portuguese. And that's different than you often see people translating these kind of dense theoretical texts. If you look at the typical English translations of, Foucault or Derrida or something, where they keep a whole bunch of these French terms, where the idea being this is a very specialized thing, and so we're going to have this special word for it. But you really found English words to use for just about all of what he was talking about. So I'm curious about your decision process behind that. How did you go about deciding what things you were going to translate when it comes down to some of this really technical terminology, or terminology that he's using in a technical kind of sense?
That's a really interesting question. I struggled a lot over how to translate a lot of these concepts, and I think ultimately there's two different things that drove every decision about translation, and one is legibility of the text. I think this is such a difficult text. It's a difficult text to read in Portuguese. It's an extremely difficult text to translate. And I think that that's true of his writing in general, that I felt that it was an important responsibility as a translator to have the work be very legible in English, to make it sound like English, and in order to really have it be read and understood. And so that was one of the, so I translated the book and I went over it many, 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 many times to constantly compare what he's saying in Portuguese with how I represented it in English. And it, translation is always, I think, in part a work of interpretation. And so I tried to stay true to the text while departing from the actual linguistic formulations whenever necessary to make it legible to an English-speaking audience. Because I think it's so important that, given its complexity, it be really legible. And then secondly, every one of these concepts he's in conversation. I mean, maybe everyone is a overgeneralization, but I think it might be true. He's in conversation with many different languages. And so what I did when I was translating the different philosophical concepts was I looked for the way that the people that he was in conversation with were most commonly translated into English, or if they were writing in English, wrote in English, right? So one of his major, for techniques, the person that he was the most in conversation with was like Jacques Ellul, whose use of that term is often translated as technique. So I tried to find and I think that given the amount of different citations that he has there, and I think given the way that he presents it as a concept, it would be very easy for people to go and find all of the other ways that word is put forward. I think there could be an argument for translating it in a different way, but I thought that I tried to find the way that was most commonly, most directly with whom he was in conversation. And I think, this word means something a little bit different to everyone who's using it also, right? And so that seemed to be the one that was truest to the way that he was using it.
Okay, well, so this is clearly a huge project and a big accomplishment to get this book out. So what are you working on next? What's your next big project?
I mean, what I'm working on now is exactly this, working through this question that you, one of the most recent questions that you put to me, which is this question of like, what is the meaning of Santos for today? Right now that this book is finished and we can elucidate these concepts, I'm working on writing about what these concepts mean and what they can contribute to our world today. So, if we look around the world, as not only the manufacturing sector, but the service sector is being automated, nearly half of the world's 8 billion people have a smartphone. Our financial, medical, educational, informational, social lives are directly mediated through screens and networks. And every one of these interactions is subjected to surveillance by corporations and the state, who are consciously and openly, manipulating these locations of mediation for their own ends of profit making and power concentration. I think like Santos's work becomes really key, right? It's like certainly these technical shifts, or these technological changes are not unrelated to the social decomposition that we're living through, that's evident in like the crisis of political representation, cancel culture, skyrocketing rates of mental illness, and the collapse of the rent-based global economy. And so I'm trying to kind of use I'm working on trying to use Santos's framework for understanding all of the very rapid shifts that we're living through today, over this last couple of years, over the last decade. And also inspired by his work, asking like if we can examine these changes through this framework of understanding a technical history rather than a technological one, how can we avoid falling into a technologically deterministic reading of them? And then asking these questions like, what kind of society seeks the mechanical moderation of all of our social relations? And how might we build a different kind of society? Those are the questions that I'm investigating now.
All right. Well, there are some exciting questions. We'll be looking forward to seeing the kind of answers that you can come up with. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me. And thank you for, I hope that people read the book and start to use Santos's work more commonly in Anglophone geography.
Yeah, this is definitely something that's worth some deep engagement. So you just heard a conversation with Brenda Belletti, translator of The Nature of Space by Milton Santos, published this year by Duke University Press.